Welcome to the new series of books by Taleteller Club, concise books that give you what you need to know on hundreds of subjects. Ch1. Rebel Queens, Women, Punk, and the Sound of Resistance, Chapter 1, New York, by Sarnia de la Mare. Chapter 1, New York. Where the noise began, and where it ended up. The room was hot, rank with beer and body odor, lights flickering through cigarette smoke. CBGB wasn't a temple so much as a sewer mouth, coughing up sound. Patti Smith stood on the lip of the stage, lean and electric, her hair a dark storm around a face that refused to smile. She wasn't pretty, and that was the point. Her voice cracked, sneered, soared. Every syllable spat into the microphone was an act of defiance, against the industry, against gender, against the idea that art should behave itself. This was 1975, and something unnameable was happening in New York's Bowery district. The Velvet Underground had already cracked the veneer of polite rock, television, talking heads, and Blondie were tuning up in neighboring basements. But the noise that mattered wasn't just musical, it was philosophical. It was the sound of ownership. Women, for the first time in rock's messy history, weren't waiting to be discovered or desired. They were occupying. Patti Smith declared that rock was the highest form of art, and she meant it in the most primitive way. No polish, no permission. A microphone, a reverb pedal, a poem. Her androgyny was not a costume but a weapon, and her performances blurred the line between invocation and insurrection. Debbie Harry followed in sequence, weaponizing glamour the same way Smith weaponized language. Blondie was art school subversion in disco drag, irony laced with fury. And yet, while New York was birthing the attitude, London was preparing the revolution. Across the Atlantic, teenage girls were trading safety pins and spray paint for microphones. They watched news of the Ramones in television through grainy photographs and thought, we can do that too, and better. Polly Styrene's voice was the anti-pop snarl the world didn't know it needed. When she screamed, "Oh, bondage! Up yours," it was both a declaration and a diagnosis, a manifesto for every woman who had been sold a fantasy of femininity wrapped in plastic. Susie Sue, cool as chrome, made aggression look regal. Viv Albertine of the Slits shredded the last vestiges of nice girl decorum on her guitar strings, her riffs a middle finger to etiquette. If New York had created the noise, Britain gave it a body, loud, imperfect, and defiantly female. The American scene made rebellion sound intelligent, the British scene made it look dangerous. Punk had crossed the ocean and slipped into latex and eyeliner. Vivienne Westwood's boutique, Sex, became a laboratory for reinvention. Jordan Mooney prowled its shop floor like a high priestess of confrontation, her painted face and peroxide hair an affront to every office secretary in Britain. Westwood's designs were part costume, part commentary, reminding the world that the female body could be armor as easily as ornament. The British women of punk didn't ask to join the movement, they were the movement. Their anger was domestic and political, their rebellion both aesthetic and existential. They screamed not just to be heard, but to rewrite the rules of hearing itself. By 1978, the revolution had exported itself again, to Europe, to zines, to the underground film scene, to girls recording demos on cheap cassette decks. The scream had become a language. 2. The silence before the scream. Before punk, there was a pause, a long, uncomfortable one. Women in rock existed, but they were exceptions, not architects. They were allowed to sing, to shimmer, to ache, but never to threaten. The microphone was a prop, the guitar a novelty, and the industry a closed door disguised as a velvet rope. The 1960s had promised liberation, but the revolution came wrapped in miniskirts and camera flashes. The women of pop were sold as fantasies, perfect hair, perfect heartbreak, perfect obedience. Dusty Springfield, Marianne Faithfull, Sandy Shaw, all voices of exquisite restraint, each framed by a male producer, a male songwriter, a male idea of what a woman should sound like. Even those who broke through the mold, Janis Joplin's raw howl, Grace Slick's acid command, Nico's haunted detachment, were treated as aberrations, not prophets. They were wild, difficult, tragic. Rock critics fetishized their pain but ignored their craft. The mythology of self-destruction became the only narrative permitted to a woman who sang too loudly. The industry loved its muses and tolerated its sirens, but it had no vocabulary for women who wanted to make noise rather than music. The studio was male, the stage was male, even the rebellion was male. The Rolling Stones could swagger through sex and politics with impunity, a woman with the same energy was a scandal. Then, somewhere between the last sigh of the hippie dream and the first crunch of distorted guitar strings, the silence cracked. The economy was collapsing. Britain was broke. The future looked like a bin fire, and for the first time, young women realized they didn't need to ask permission to be furious. Punk arrived not as a style, but as an answer. It didn't ask to be pretty. It didn't even ask to be good. It only asked to be real. For girls who had grown up watching Top of the Pops, this was revelation. The idea that you could take 3 chords, a cheap amp, and a sense of injustice, and exist loudly, was almost mystical. The barriers between audience and performer, between muse and maker, between femininity and ferocity, all of it could be torn down with a safety pin. When Patti Smith first stepped onto a stage in a day-glow dress and dental braces, she detonated decades of expectation. When Susie Sue stared down the camera in a black vinyl corset, she turned the male gaze inside out. When Ari Up, still a teenager, led the Slits in shredding reggae and patriarchy alike, she turned chaos into currency. And in its place came feedback, shrill, messy, joyous feedback, the sound of women discovering that noise could be a form of freedom. If punk had a creation myth, its gods were misfits, but its goddesses were prophets. No one invited them to the table, they built their own, out of amplifiers and rage. When Patti Smith walked on stage in 1977, she looked like no one else in music. Small, brown-skinned, braces flashing under the lights, wearing a plastic dress from a charity shop. The male journalists called her odd, shrill, unfashionable. She called herself a germ-free adolescent. While her contemporaries mimed seduction, Patti dissected consumerism and identity with the same precision she used to shred through identity and germ-free adolescence. Her lyrics were prophecies of modern feminism, body autonomy, mixed-race visibility, the politics of self-image, all shouted over jagged guitars. Susie Sue, by contrast, turned herself into an icon of immaculate control. She wasn't angry in the way the press wanted her to be. She was poised, predatory, imperial. Her stare was armor, her voice a scalpel. Where Patti exploded, Susie carved. She took the aesthetics of fetish wear, Catholicism, and glam, and made them ritualistic, each performance a liturgy of power. For a generation of young women, she embodied the idea that you didn't have to soften yourself to be seen. The Slits were chaos incarnate. Led by Ari Up, their sound was neither punk nor reggae but something deliriously in between, as if the music itself refused to obey. They weren't playing at rebellion, they were rebellion. Viv Albertine's guitar work was jagged and glorious, a tangle of rhythm and dissent. She once said punk was an attitude, not a sound, and in her hands, even silence sounded disobedient. And then there was Debbie Harry, the woman who proved that glamour and subversion could share a lipstick. Blondie were never purely punk, but Harry's irony weaponized femininity. She looked like Marilyn Monroe through a cracked lens, singing about heartbreak with a smirk that said she'd caused it on purpose. In a scene allergic to beauty, she dared to be beautiful on her own terms. Together, these women detonated every cliché that had been chained to the word female musician. They weren't backup singers or groupies or ornaments. They were theorists, designers, strategists. Each was building a new mythology for what a woman could be on stage, feral, unfiltered, and untouchable. The irony, of course, was that punk's promise of equality wasn't always honored within its own ranks. The scene could be just as macho, just as exclusionary, as the establishment it claimed to despise. Women were still groped, dismissed, talked over. But they didn't leave, they amplified. The scream had begun, and there was no turning it down. By the early 1990s, punk had grown older, but its daughters were just waking up. What began in the basements of New York and the backrooms of London exploded again in Olympia, Washington, this time photocopied and stapled together. The Riot Grrrl movement wasn't about nostalgia. It was about inheritance, a generation of young women rediscovering the radical tools their mothers had dropped. They had no money, no managers, no patience. They had zines, cassette tapes, and a hunger to talk about what the boys refused to hear. Punk had given women permission to scream. Riot Grrrl taught them how to organize. The aesthetic was deliberately rough, handwritten manifestos, Xeroxed collages, DIY gigs in community halls. The message was sharp and unapologetic. Kathleen Hanna, fronting Bikini Kill, declared from the stage, "Girls to the front." Not as a marketing slogan but a physical act of reclamation. In a world of motioning elbows and male egos, she was carving out space for female presence, agency, and sound. Every zine, Girl Germs, Jigsaw, Bikini Kill, Chainsaw, was a mini manifesto, trading recipes for survival as much as rebellion. They talked about sexual assault, body image, queerness, and mental health, all the subjects that the mainstream press still called taboo. They created an underground press where emotion was intellect and vulnerability was weaponry. It was punk's second revolution, and this time the leaders were unashamedly feminist. The Riot Grrrl ethos seeped into fashion, photography, and film, less about looking fierce, more about owning your fury. Doc Martens became symbols of solidarity. Hair dye became a badge of identity. The music wasn't always perfect, but perfection was never the point. The imperfection was the art. In the UK, the echo was immediate. Huggy Bear, Skin Teen, and Linus channeled Bikini Kill's raw minimalism with British irony and grit. Across Europe, women's zine networks sprang up faster than they could be catalogued. The technology was analog, but the effect was viral. What made Riot Grrrl vital wasn't only its sound, it was the infrastructure. Women no longer needed gatekeepers to validate their creativity. They could record, print, distribute, and tour without permission. Punk's DIY had become feminist praxis. Looking back, Riot Grrrl can seem almost quaint beside today's digital feminism, hashtags instead of photocopies, live streams instead of fanzines. Yet its heartbeat remains familiar: autonomy, noise, and connection. It proved that anger could be communal, and that rebellion could be gentle, even joyful. The scream had matured. It had learned language, tactics, solidarity. And it was preparing, unknowingly, for the algorithmic future, where every woman with a camera phone would become her own broadcast network. If music was punk's weapon, style was its shrapnel. Every torn stocking, ripped t-shirt, and scrawled slogan was a declaration: "I am not here to please you." In the late 70s, while men in punk bands could still look like roadies, women had to invent a new visual language just to exist. They did it with scissors and eyeliner. Fashion, once the enemy of authenticity, became its accomplice. Vivienne Westwood turned rebellion into design philosophy. Her shop, Sex, at 430 Kings Road, was an art installation disguised as retail. Latex, leather, chains, not as fetish, but as commentary. Her collaborator Malcolm McLaren may have been the strategist, but it was Westwood who gave punk its silhouette, a ragged union of aristocratic decay and working-class ingenuity. Jordan Mooney, the shop's muse, prowled the streets of Chelsea like a performance piece, bleached hair sculpted into impossible shapes, face painted like a hieroglyph of defiance. Her look wasn't costume, it was confrontation. She turned the act of being seen into political theater. For women, punk fashion was never just about decoration. It was a critique of the beauty myth, a revolt against domesticity. A ladder in your tights wasn't a flaw, it was an uprising. Safety pins held more than fabric, they held the ideology together. Susie Sue understood this instinctively. She built her image like a cathedral of control: black vinyl, coal rings, crucifix earrings, hair as architecture. Her look fused the religious and the erotic, the sacred and the blasphemous. In a media culture obsessed with objectifying women, she became the observer, the one who stared back. Polystyrene went the opposite way, rejecting allure altogether. She wore day-glow plastic in braces, daring audiences to confront their own assumptions about desirability. In her clothes, as in her lyrics, she declared herself outside of the system, a future-facing creature, part human, part poster. Then came the slits, rolling in mud and laughter for their cut album cover. Half-naked, dreadlocked, and smeared with clay, they looked like pagan warriors rather than pop stars. It wasn't about seduction, it was about ownership. Their bodies were theirs, for running, drumming, screaming. Through fashion, punk women dismantled the hierarchy of the gaze. They refused to be pretty, passive, or palatable. They dressed for each other, for solidarity, for satire. And by doing so, they prefigured entire movements, queer fashion, body-positive art, even the gender-fluid aesthetics of the digital age. Punk wasn't about the clothes, but the clothes were about freedom. They said what the lyrics couldn't: we are visible, and we are dangerous. Intersectionality and the forgotten rebels. For all its noise about revolution, punk was never a utopia. Behind the slogans and safety pins lay the same structures that ruled the rest of the world: race, class, sexuality, and privilege. The movement promised liberation, but liberation isn't evenly distributed. Polystyrene was already aware of that hypocrisy. As a mixed-race woman fronting X-ray SPX in late 1970s Britain, she faced every stereotype at once: too loud, too brown, too clever. When she screamed identity, it wasn't art school irony, it was autobiography. Her rejection of beauty culture and consumerism was more than aesthetic, it was survival in a scene that fetishized white alienation while ignoring the brown body living it. In New York, Debbie Harry drew from the downtown queer avant-garde, borrowing from drag queens and performance artists who rarely made the album sleeves. Blondie's glitter-slick irony was born in the same clubs where Divine, Jane County, and Holly Woodlawn blurred gender long before mainstream culture knew what to call it. Their influence remains uncredited but unmistakable. Punk's gender play was queer from the start. Across the Atlantic, Polystyrene was joined by other pioneers: Pauline Black of the Selector, Rhoda Dakar of the Body Snatchers, and Nene Cherry, who fused punk's urgency with funk and hip-hop rhythm. Each fought a double battle, against the system and the scene. The ska and post-punk worlds were multiracial, but the press still wrote about them in hierarchies: black authenticity versus white rebellion, never both at once. Working-class women, too, were often erased in favor of art school narratives. For every Viv Albertine or Susie Sue, there were hundreds of anonymous girls with Woolworth's guitars and rented amps, playing in council estate garages. They had no press agents, no safety net, and no interest in theory. Their punk was not a fashion statement but a form of labor, a night job after the day shift, an act of endurance as much as art. Punk's mythology, built largely by male journalists, flattened these complexities into archetypes: the muse, the rebel, the groupie, the freak. Intersectional stories didn't fit the headline. But in the fragments, photocopied gig flyers, half-erased demo tapes, oral histories whispered through fanzine margins, the full map emerges: a network of women who remixed rebellion to suit their own survival. Today, the archives are catching up. Online repositories, community historians, and digital zine libraries are piecing together what the industry forgot. It turns out the underground was always plural, always political, always female. The revolution wasn't televised, it was dubbed, traded, and hidden in drawers until the Wi-Fi came along. Punk promised equality, and its women made it happen, again and again, even when no one was watching. The internet didn't kill punk. It uploaded it. When the world moved online, the promise of DIY multiplied 1,000-fold. The zines became blogs, the fanzines became forums, and the photocopier was replaced by the share button. What once took an evening with glue sticks and staples could now reach thousands in a heartbeat. At first, the old guard sneered. Punk, they said, couldn't survive the screen. But they were wrong. The screen became the new stage, and women once again led the noise. Digital punk wasn't a sound, it was an attitude translated into code. Riot Grrrl's handmade manifestos evolved into feminist blogs, MySpace bans, YouTube diaries, and zine archives built by volunteers with broadband instead of bus fare. The same girls who once shouted into microphones were now shouting into microphones and webcams. Kathleen Hanna, decades after Bikini Kill, used Tumblr to reach a new generation of listeners who hadn't been born when Rebel Girl was released. Online spaces became the squats of the 2000s, messy, loud, and filled with possibility. From LiveJournal confessionals to TikTok DIY tutorials, the web was a continuation of the punk principle: don't wait for permission, publish, perform, protest. Fashion followed too. The fetish wear of Westwood became digital drag, safety pins turned into filters and avatars. On social media, punk's anti-aesthetic thrived in meme culture, bright, brash, self-aware, and often hilarious. The line between protest and performance blurred, just as it had in 1977. The old mohawks were now coded in pixels, the old slogans hashtagged. And yet the politics endured. Online collectives like Decolonize Fest and Afropunk reclaimed spaces that the original scene had neglected. Trans and non-binary punks reshaped gender expression with the same ferocity Susie once applied to mascara. Bandcamp replaced record labels, Discord replaced rehearsal rooms. The technology changed, the rebellion didn't. Read the rest on Amazon Kindle for free, written by Trixie Jones.